Hello everyone, I hope you're all doing well. Today in things that I never thought I'd hear myself say, we are going to be building a life-size Tauntaun. Well, a life-size Tauntaun bust. Not that I wouldn't attempt the entire thing, but this is a surprise for my best friend, and I'm pretty sure if I rolled up with a full-blown Tauntaun, he'd probably kill me. All that being said, let's start bringing this iconic Star Wars creature to life. I'll be using the Great Ape Studio files as the base for my build. By my calculations of what the approximate size of a full-scale Tauntaun should be, I ended up scaling the files to 160%. Originally, I'd calculated it out to be 167%, but at that scale, I couldn't fit certain pieces on my Cobra 2 Max, which is the largest 3D printer I own. Even then, I had to still split everything up into quite a few parts, but I didn't want to compromise with having to split the front of the face where you'd have a seam running down the center of the nose. And with this being such a large creature, are you really going to be able to tell a 7% size difference? Probably not. I printed everything in Anycubic's high-speed PLA. It's an incredibly smooth filament, so I was hoping that it would end up saving me a bit on post-processing time later on. Thankfully, there won't have to be much, since the majority of this head is going to get covered in fur. Even though this bust was split into 9 parts, each individual piece was still absolutely massive, especially this front face piece. It was by far the largest piece and the longest print, but it's such an impressive looking part. With this being an organic creature, finding out a good print orientation for some of these parts was interesting. I tried to do my best with finding a balance with what would look best on the finished piece and not going overboard with the support material needed to print it in that orientation. In total, I used about 5 kilograms of filament for all of these parts. Now that everything's printed, the first step is support removal and cleanup. There were really only a couple of pieces that ended up having quite a lot of supports, and that was mostly this ear piece and the main face part. The rest were pretty minimal if they even had support at all. Because all of the parts were so large though, I did end up printing everything with a brim on it just to avoid any possible warping, so most of my time was spent removing the brims. The last prep step that I had for these pieces was actually cutting out the eye section. I could have done this digitally, but I decided to do it the old-fashioned way, and I didn't film it to avoid scarring you all for life. But after that, it was then on to the thankfully not super intense post-process. Even though, again, this was mostly going to get covered in fur, there are some areas that are still going to be left as skin, and I wanted to make sure that they were in a good and non-layer liney condition. So I really tried to keep my sanding to those areas only to not waste any time. So that was mostly the nose, around the mouth, and around the eyes, and also the horns and ears, which were all part of these 2 pieces, and other than that, the only parts that I did any post-processing on were the horns themselves, since they're not fur covered. I started off with using my hot knife and this flat attachment to try and smooth out the areas where the support material was. I was really trying to keep this as low hassle for myself as possible, so from there I diluted some Bondo spot putty with acetone so that I could start brushing it onto these horns. The prints themselves looked really clean, but I knew if I just decided to start putting paint on them, I was going to see a bunch of layer lines show up, but it did print the really interesting texture that these horns should have, so I didn't want to try sanding and smoothing them out too much, so I figured going with the spot putty brush on method would hopefully smooth out the areas that I didn't want to see and, you know, make it not look like a 3D print, but still keep a lot of that texture that was printed into this part. After some light sanding of the spot putty, it was time to add a couple of layers of filler primer onto these horns. And that was everything that I did for the more typical post-processing of these pieces, which was a bit of a shock to my system compared to what I'm used to dealing with. There is quite a lot of assembly to still tackle though. I decided to start from the back and work my way forward because it seemed like that might be the easiest way to assemble everything together. So did start out with glue, but then I also went in with my plastic welder to add these metal staples along the seam. For everything else, I used my favorite 5-minute set plastic weld that you see me use in practically every video at this point. It seems to create a really strong bond regardless of the type of filament that I'm using for a project, and the the 5-minute set time works great for the workflow that I have. This section was probably the trickiest area to glue together because I knew I was going to have to glue the two halves of the bottom together at the same time as it to the back plate, because if I didn't, there was going to be gaps all over, and even then there still was, and you can see I added the metal staples as well to really pin everything in place. To close up that gap, I decided to try out this steel stick, which is kind of like really intense epoxy sculpt. It's a 2-part putty that you mix together until it's a uniform color, and then you can sort of just spread it on, and this worked great to close up that giant gaping hole between these two parts. This is of course all gonna get covered, so I really didn't care so much about the aesthetics as I did the strength of the bond of everything. So this probably wouldn't be the best choice for every project, but for this one it worked great. But then it was back to gluing more of these parts together. You can literally see me waiting here because a little trick that I do is I try and wait out as much of the 5-minute set time as possible so that by the time I have this spread on and I have the two pieces attached, it's not running all over the place. I'm not having to hold it in place for prolonged periods of time. But in this case, I did end up adding those metal staples to pin everything so that I didn't have to hold on to these parts. I mean, it was also to make sure that the bond between the seams was like indestructible, but having the option to pin the parts down exactly where I wanted them to be was amazing, because some of these pieces really just did not want to go together. This was really the only good way to make sure that everything was lined up as best as it possibly could. And the final piece to add to this was of course the front face piece. Because this meant I was closing up the whole head, it meant that I couldn't add the metal staples right away, but I did go into the back afterward to make sure that everything was super secure. But even beyond that, I decided to add some quick weld to the backs of all of the seams. I swear this video isn't sponsored by JB Weld, it's just accidentally worked out like this. This is how I used to put all of my helmets together to make sure that they wouldn't accidentally crack at the seams. It's worked flawlessly for me so far, so I figured it would be good enough for a tauntaun. After everything had set, I brought the bust back into my workshop. I mounted it onto a piece of masonite board and stuck it on my easel so that I could work on it easier. Honestly, this was one of the best decisions I made this entire build. The first thing I did on this now fully assembled tauntaun head was start texturizing the front of the face. Well, basically anywhere that's not going to end up having fur. So the nose, the sides of the nose, around the eyes, and even the horn, of course, has a very distinct texture. When it's around the nose, it has that leathery, skin-like effect. So I used some of my extra thick resin mixture, which is just UV printer resin mixed in with fumed silica powder to make it really thick, as the name would suggest, and then just applied that with a sponge brush and further textured it with a sea sponge to try and emulate that skin-like leathery effect. There are a few different materials and types of pastes that you could use to try and achieve this effect, but I've always found that the UV resin mixture has been really convenient and worked well. And it's also just so easy to change the consistency of the mixture to suit the project you're working on. Like here, in the case of the horns, I applied it quite thickly with a normal paintbrush and then used the sea sponge to texture it out a bit more. Once I was happy with the texture that I was working on building up, it was time to start painting this skin area. I started with some gray primer just because that was raw resin and I didn't want to take any chances with how the paint might react to the resin on its own. Once the primer had dried, it was on to the base color layer. I went with this mid-tone chocolate brown because I thought a warmer tone underneath all of the beiges and other colors that were going to get added over top would look really nice. You know, airbrush paint is always very translucent and you will very often see a lot of the color underneath all of the colors that you add over top of it, especially when you're working on more organic things like a creature like this tauntaun, at least how I prefer painting things. I tend to do mid-tone for the base layer and then I go in with the lighter color that is probably going to end up being what the majority of the finished tone should be, but I build it up really slowly, so you can probably see here that there's really not much of a difference happening between the chocolate brown and this beige that I'm adding over top of it. Like, it really does not look anything like the color does in the bottle. But for living organic creatures, very subtle tone variations and layers of color are really what sell it in being alive and realistic. which is why after I do that initial pass of the lighter color, I will go in with what might be considered a bit of a crazier color. I did water this red down a ton, but I wanted to add it into any of the areas where there was more of a pinkish hue. So around the eyes, around the nostrils, of course, in the jowls and inside of the mouth. I was of course looking at reference pictures while I was painting all of this, and I always try and break down the painting steps to be the simplest form as I possibly can. After the slight wash of red, I went in with a darker color than anything I've previously used to really push back the darker areas. And after that, I went in with an even lighter tan color to really bring out those high points again. It's just a lot of push and pull of the different paint tones until you end up somewhere in the middle where all of the different colors and tones and values are more blended and work really naturally together. The final head painting step was turning into Hoth dentistry and hand painting the teeth, or at least trying to, because this was very awkward to get at. And now I have to introduce you to one of the most ridiculous contraptions that I've ever come up with, but it worked very well. It was this random vise that I had laying around, not attached to anything, on a turntable, because I had no idea how else I was going to paint these horns. They're large, they're annoying, they were not going to be able to be held by anything other than this vise clamp, and it does look insane, but it did work, so I might have to keep this in my workshop for when I have these larger pieces to paint. The horns I kept with the same color idea and the same techniques to try and make them look like they were part of the same creature. So that chocolate brown for the base, the lighter tan that is more concentrated towards the tip of the horn, and then went in with a darker brownish gray color to push back the cracks and recesses of the horn. And here's what it ended up looking like when it dried. I ended up spraying the horns and the face with a mattifying spray because one of the paints I was using made it way too shiny, but that was everything for the paint job, which means it's now onto the fur. Before I had even started the paint job, I decided to make a template of the whole head using the very infamous cosplayer method. I don't even know what you would call it, but you wrap whatever you want a template of in plastic wrap and then cover it in normally masking tape because it's easy, and then you're left with a template that you can cut off of the object. It majority keeps its shape, and it's just a really good and easy reference to have. And in this case, to use as a template to cut out this faux fur fabric. I really wasn't concerned about these template pieces being perfect. I honestly pretty much could have just lined up and cut this fabric right on the tauntaun itself, but I figured doing the template method would have just made my life a lot easier, which it did, so I'm glad that I took that extra step. It also meant that I had a lot less waste. I really did not cut off much excess that I gave myself using these templates. And as always, when you're cutting faux fur, try and cut the back of the fabric only so that you're not left with just an entire ball of fur left over that you've accidentally cut off. Even though I was being careful, I still feel like I'm gonna be finding white fur in my workshop for the next 20 years. To attach the fur onto the tauntaun head, I just used some hot glue. It's the best stuff to use for attaching fake fur to projects like this. I also used the hot glue to fold the edges of the faux fur together so that you have a more natural looking and less obvious edge. For this top head section, I glued it down to the front first before attempting to cut the horn holes. This just seemed like it would be the easiest way to make sure that everything was lined up properly. I did really do everything in sections though to make sure that everything fit really well and that all of the seams were as hidden as possible. The last step was doing some detail work and single hair placement on the face. I used some quick drying white tacky glue for this that dries really clear, so it should blend in and hopefully make this beard section look really natural. Now that all of the fur is attached, it's time to start making it the right color. To do this, I just used really watered down acrylic paint and applied that using my airbrush because I figured it would be the most efficient way to do it. And it was. This was such an easy thing to do, way easier than the times that I've used alcohol markers to dye faux fur. So I really just applied that all over. I went lighter, closer to to the front of the face and darker towards the back. I moved the hair around a lot so that it wasn't a super uniform color to try and again make this Tauntaun look as natural as possible. I even went in with a paper towel and tried scrunching some of the color out of the ends of the fur to try and give it the impression that it maybe had a bit more of like an undercoat. And yeah, that was it for the fur, which means the last thing that this Tauntaun needs is eyeballs. I resin printed myself these custom eyeball inserts that I then painted white. No one has pure white eyeballs though, so I then added this wash of this like light caramelly color and blotted a lot of that off to give it an interesting texture. But then it was onto something that I have wanted to try out for years but have never had the project to use it on. And that is using red fibers, or in this case dyed faux fur, to create veins on an eyeball. I used some Mod Podge as the adhesive to attach these fibers, and this was so easy and worked so well. I cannot for the life of me remember where I first saw this, but I have remembered it ever since I saw it and I have always wanted to try it. But after that, the last thing that these eyeballs need are some irises. I drew these up and printed them out on some photo paper and then just stuck those to the ends of these eyeball inserts. I also added some clear UV resin onto these, just on the irises themselves, to protect them from things as well as give them a nice sheen. And the last step for these eyeballs was installing these inserts into these half clear Christmas ornaments. I use these all of the time for droid lenses, but they work great for eyeballs as well. I only ended up adding a ring of hot glue onto the back because I was concerned that you would see any adhesive and it would like cloud up the ornament itself, so figured better safe than sorry doing it this way, and these turned out perfectly. Now, in order to actually get these eyeballs into the Tauntaun head, I had to do it in the mirror because I couldn't reach my arm around it, so unfortunately it did not film that, but this is what they look like installed. And to finish off the eyes, I added some eyelashes, which is again just more of that paint dyed faux fur. And the final step for completing this Tauntaun was installing the horns, and I used hot glue for this. And here is the finished Tauntaun. This was a super fun build. As much as I love my droids, it was a really nice change to get to work on something a bit more organic. I will say I am going to miss being able to do the snoot scratches, but I know she's going to a great home. Let me know if there's any other galactic creatures you would like to see me build, preferably smaller than a Tauntaun, though I'm sure I could be convinced otherwise. But that is everything, so thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in my next video.